¿Dónde comiste, Robert? ¿Dónde comiste?
Aquí
¿En la oficina?
donde está la librería.
Ah, en el azul y oro.
¿Y usted encima?
En el Rioja, pero estaba el tráfico espantoso. Ah.
If you get to, yeah, you request a factura, but we're going to be too
Bueno. Hola, buenas tardes. El tráfico hoy estaba especialmente complicado. Me imagino que le tocó a todo el mundo aquí presente y a los que no están presentes seguramente más todavía. Pero vamos a ir empezando. Vamos a dejar todo lo que tiene que ver con comentar el funcionamiento y operación de los talleres para la siguiente sesión, y vamos a entrar a la segunda sesión de este módulo, que corresponde a la primera sesión. Ustedes recordarán, es la historia de la evolución de las universidades en Francia, los modelos de vinculación, para no hablar siquiera de desarrollo, entre la universidad y los distintos proyectos de construcción nacional, de desarrollo económico, a partir de Napoleón en Francia, el papel de la universidad en Alemania, con la Universidad de Humboldt, y en Inglaterra un poco, que tocó el doctor Roberto Rodríguez en la sesión pasada, ¿no? Hoy vamos a analizar la emergencia, digamos, de una tradición universitaria que hoy es extremadamente relevante en el mundo, que es la tradición norteamericana. El doctor Kempner nos va a hablar de cómo surge esta tradición y cómo conecta esa tradición con el mundo contemporáneo, y con distintas referencias a los temas del desarrollo y la vinculación de la Universidad Norteamericana con el desarrollo económico, político y social en este país. La siguiente sesión, que va a ser después del puente, el doctor Yussi Balima va a hablar de la Universidad Continental Europea, y con bastante énfasis en lo que ha sido todo lo que se llama el proceso de Bolonia, que de alguna manera sintetiza el debate contemporáneo en esa región del mundo sobre el papel de la universidad en la sociedad del conocimiento y en el mundo contemporáneo, ¿no? Realmente me da mucho gusto que todos ustedes, incluyendo aquí a los compañeros y compañeras que asisten a esta sesión a través de videoconferencia en la Universidad Autónoma del Estado de México y en la ENEP Aragón, que tengan la oportunidad de escuchar a un queridísimo colega, el doctor Kenneth Kempner, Ken Kempner, nunca firma Kenneth, ¿no? Se quitó ese pedazo del nombre. El doctor Kempner está en la actualidad en la Universidad del Sur de Oregon, en la pequeña ciudad de Ashland, casi en la frontera de Oregon con California. Estuvo antes en la Universidad de Oregon en Eugene, y estuvo también en la Universidad de Portland, incluso antes que en la Universidad de Oregon. Psicólogo de origen, no hay que tomar eso en contra suya necesariamente. Se dedicó al tema de educación superior desde diferentes perspectivas. En una etapa con un trabajo muy sistemático sobre lo que se llaman los community colleges, los colegios comunitarios en Estados Unidos, con un conjunto de estudios, pero sobre todo uno de ellos que se constituyó en el trabajo y la referencia fundamental sobre este tipo de educación superior o de educación terciaria en Estados Unidos, ¿no? Y para después dedicarse a dos grandes vertientes que han sido las perspectivas culturales de análisis de la educación superior, que de alguna manera se sintetizó en un libro que editó junto con William Tierney, que se llama Perspectivas Culturales en la Educación Superior. Y la otra gran vertiente son los estudios comparativos de educación superior. Tanto por su experiencia personal de haber vivido en Brasil en distintos momentos, como por la enorme cantidad de conexiones que tiene con colegas en distintos países del mundo, muchos de los cuales fueron sus estudiantes y siguen manteniendo una intensa relación académica con él. Ken ha establecido una trayectoria larga y sistemática de estudios comparados de educación superior que involucran estudios sobre Brasil, sobre Angola, sobre Japón y sobre México, ¿no? Muchas veces en coautoría con colegas de estos países, otras veces de manera individual. Para terminar, quiero mencionar que a últimas fechas ha coordinado dos libros muy importantes. Uno es el Compendio de Educación Superior Comparativa, publicado por Taylor and Francis, ¿no? Se llama Comparative Education. Y el segundo es la Educación Superior y la Esfera de lo Público, también publicado por Taylor and Francis y que ha sido que acaba de salir a la luz hace solo unos meses. En estos libros él tiene, además del papel de coordinador y editor del libro, capítulos muy interesantes sobre distintas temáticas, muchas que se acercan a lo que ha sido la temática central del Seminario de Educación Superior, que son perspectivas políticas en el análisis de la educación superior en distintos ámbitos del mundo. Entonces, sin más preámbulo, dejo con ustedes al doctor Kempner, y estoy seguro que va a ser no solo provechosa, instructiva, inquietante, estimulante, sino además de todo divertida, porque ese es el estilo que tiene nuestro querido colega Ken. Bienvenido, Ken, gracias por estar aquí.
I think I understood all of that. Thank you. First, let me apologize for not being able to do this in Spanish or Portuguese. My Portuguese is better than my Spanish, but my apologies. It's not a good idea for me to come to Mexico and then speak to you in English, but my Spanish isn't good enough. First off, thank you, Imanol, very much in the Seminario for inviting me, and this is my third or fourth visit to UNAM, I think. And it's always a pleasure to come, and I'm always amazed at the quality of students and the quality of the research that you do here. And I think that now you're studying it in very good ways as well. Well, let me begin by introducing you. Are we up on the screen yet?
Sí, pueden poner por favor el... Parece que hay un problemita con el PowerPoint para que esté en la pantalla, entonces vamos a esperar unos segundos.
Well, I can hold up. That's okay. We can. Here, I'll go to my.
Espera un momento. Wait a second.
Oh, he's got it? Oh, good. Okay. Good. So, I thought the way to begin the PowerPoint is to have the symbol of the Pumas, and we are the Hawks. And so football is just as important to us as it is to you. So this is the essence of any university, probably, unfortunately. But so we have the competing sides. Oh, better. Good, thanks. Oh, good, I can hear myself now. Good. So we have both symbols for us. Good. Thank you for the translation, Marion, that did the translation, and also for the translator that we have today. The last time I worked with a translator, I was in Taiwan. Is it working? No? No, nada? Are we hearing anything now? No? Okay? Okay, good, good. Okay. Thank you for the translator. And I was saying the last time I did a simultaneous translation, I was in Taiwan. And we had 5 different translations. We had booths in Chinese and Korean and Japanese, and I kept moving away from the translation, and the translators would signal, no, we don't know what you're doing. So let me begin with my thesis for the discussion today. And I don't mind if you have questions for clarification while I'm talking. Please go ahead and raise your hand and ask. That would be okay, and then we'll do more questions later after we take the break. But if there's something that you'd like to check on or a question that you have, I would certainly be able to stop and take the question. My main thesis is that in the United States, we are failing in our support of higher education. And so I'm using the analogy of eating our seed corn. And I'm not sure if this makes sense, so I'll try and explain it just a little bit and see if it works. The notion of seed corn is, of course, when you're a farmer and you plant your corn, you have to save a little bit at the end of the year so you can have corn for next year. That's the seed corn. And so if you don't save that corn, you won't have anything for the next year and you'll starve. Well, my thesis is that we are eating our seed corn in the United States. That is, we are not investing in higher education. We're not saving enough back, and we're not looking ahead to the future because we're disinvesting in higher education. I think this is a great tragedy in the United States because it's not a tragedy that we're not number one. We don't have to be number one in everything. In fact, I was very happy to see the Japanese women beat the United States in the World Soccer Cup because we have to get used to sharing. We don't have to be number one. And in fact, it's good for us to be able to share and let Japan win or other countries win. But the problem with higher education is that we have been number one in higher education, and we really should remain, if not number one, one of the best in higher education. Because the United States, we are changing in our economy. We're not going to make refrigerators anymore. We're not very good at making automobiles. We're not a manufacturing country anymore, and that's okay. But we are a country of ideas. So Microsoft and Apple and Hollywood, and you can run down the list of the things that we're very good at. We're very good at ideas, and we're very good at concepts, and then having other people manufacture them. And that's fine. Well, where do these ideas come from? And how do we develop a country that's strong on ideas and has a strong intellectual foundation? Well, that comes from the universities. So we are in danger, if we don't keep supporting universities in the United States, of losing our economy and losing our status. So my thesis in this discussion, and often in some of my writing, is that we don't understand what we're the best at. And as hard for me to point, as Brooks says, this is the best that we have is higher education. And we should continue to be very good at it. So what I want to do in the time we have is give you just a brief overview of the background of the perspectives in U.S. higher education. But then I also want to talk about comparative higher education. And you're all probably familiar with the league tables and the ratings that universities have throughout the world. So I would like to talk about that a little bit in relationship to the U.S., but also in relationship to what I know about Mexico. Now, I'm certainly not an expert on Mexico, but I can bring some perspectives from the outside as an observer and somebody who knows Mexico fairly well for an American, thanks to my esteemed colleague, Imanol, Beto, a number of friends who've taught me a lot about Mexico and continue. Well, briefly, the origins of higher education in the United States, I think, can go back to Thomas Jefferson. I have to read my part in English so I know where I am. That we have to have an educated electorate. And the reason a democracy can work is by having an educated electorate, people who can make wise decisions when they vote. And without that, democracies can't work very well. We lapse into dictatorship. But we've had some problems with this notion in the United States of having an educated electorate. The first thing is that we think we're so special. And that's U.S. exceptionalism, that this has driven the United States, and it's both been an advantage and a disadvantage. It's been an advantage is that it's allowed us to be a very strong democracy, but it's been a disadvantage because we have an ego that is probably too big for the world. And so we think it's our responsibility or it's our job to protect everybody from themselves. So we go off and make wars everywhere, and we think we're in charge. Well, I don't particularly like that, but that's the U.S. exceptionalism, that, oh, we're exceptional people, so we should do this. Well, nobody elected us to be the world police. So I think we have to understand, again, we have to share a bit better. It's just fine that the Japanese women beat us at soccer. In fact, it was a good lesson for us. The United States has, and I don't know about Mexico, but in the United States we have this contrast between these, we think we're exceptional, but we have this conflict between anti-intellectualism and intellectualism. Is that we have, again, we're a nation of ideas, but we have a very strong anti-intellectual aspect of the United States. And I'm sure you've heard of the red states and the blue states. And so this is nothing new. It just has a label now. But it's very much been the anti-intellectualism in the United States between people who are educated and people who are not. And this has been a continuing tension in the United States. And we see it even more so now with the blue states and the red states and the Republicans against the Democrats. We could use a few more political parties that might help. But much of the origins of the United States education had a religious nature in its origin. And as I'll talk about a little bit when we look at universities like Harvard and Yale, they began as religious institutions because, as you might remember, the United States was essentially formed on religious purposes. It was an escape from Great Britain and a chance to have to practice one's own religion. And that was a good thing that they came to the United States, but it's permeated a lot of our laws and ideas, and that's why we have so much trouble in the United States and arguments over gay rights, and we have so much argument over abortion and freedom of choice for women, because we still have this underlying religious perspective and the conflict between the intellectuals and anti-intellectuals, the red states and the blue states. And so we have all this tension that's surrounding higher education. So this brings us to this contested nature of higher education. And so very much we're involved in culture wars in the United States, where we have conflicts by race, conflicts by gender, and conflicts by class. And so our conflicts by race are probably more well known to you because it's very clear. We have blacks against whites, we have whites against Hispanics, we have Hispanics against blacks. And these are not very good lessons or perspectives on the United States. And if you remember Katrina, the hurricane, was an interesting way for people both in the United States and outside of the United States to see what we might call the underbelly of the United States. This was the United States in its very contested aspect, where we had black people not able to escape from New Orleans and not being taken care of, and the white people did just fine. And so it was very much a class issue as who was saved, who was protected, and as it played out in the media. And so we see this played out in lesser extents between who has access to higher education, who doesn't have access to higher education. And so we have this continued culture war about who has access based on these issues of gender, race, and class. One thing that, and actually Imanol and I have discussed this and probably argued about it a bit with this notion of what's the ideology of the state in relationship to higher education. And this is from Althusser's work, the idea that the state uses education as an ideological tool. And so is this true, and how does this get played out? And I think it's both. Sometimes the state definitely uses higher education as an ideological tool, and other times higher education acts autonomously and independently. And I think there are different sorts of issues that happen that we'll talk about. But I think it's an interesting issue to think about, is that what's the ideology of the state and how does it get played out in higher education? And we'll see this with how higher education supports students with financial aid, how higher education does or doesn't support students with affirmative action. And so these are some of the issues of ideology that we have in U.S. higher education. At the top here, I have the difference of democratization versus reproduction and the role of education. And the two symbols I put on the top are the one on the left is Harvard, which you all know, which is essentially the top of the pyramid in the United States for education. And the one on the right that you don't know is Rogue Community College, which is a small community college near where I live in Southern Oregon. And so these are the extremes of higher education, from Harvard at the very, very top, that of course comes out #1 in most polls, and then Rogue Community College that you've never heard of. And but they both provide an equally important role for the people who attend them. And so the students who go to Rogue Community College tend to be working class students. Often they are first generation college students, and they come from working class and middle class families. But I think it's important for us in the United States to understand we have this breadth of colleges that we have to serve. And so we can't just only think of Harvard. Harvard is a unique case. In fact, Rogue Community College is probably more relevant to more Americans than Harvard University is. And so when we talk about serving the needs of the population and the role that higher education plays, whether it's an ideological tool of the state or not, we have to look at those differences between those two. This is a term that I've always liked from Carnot and Levin's work, and that where they distinguish between the purpose of education is to democratize on one hand or reproduce on the other. And so the notion of democratization is to educate the electorate, to make good citizens, and to improve individuals in their intellectual aspects. Whereas reproduction is merely to reproduce the existing class structure. So if your father or mother was a carpenter, then you're going to be a carpenter or a plumber. And so that's the idea of we reproduce the existing class structure. And so the differences between those two are at the extremes, of course. And in society, especially in the United States, we move back and forth between democratization and reproduction. And right now, I would propose we are very much in a reproduction mode of higher education. John Kennedy, President Kennedy, that you all know, very much moved us into a democratization way of education, is that his idea was to educate the electorate. But under Reagan and subsequent presidents, we've swung back to the reproduction side. And so it's a little too much out of balance right now. I think we need to move back more to the democratization side. And so this is a debate we're having in the United States of how you fund universities, for what purpose do you fund universities, and what's the purpose of higher education, certainly. So I think we look at the two extremes. One of the issues for higher education, though, that we want to think about is that a term that Torres and Morrow use is the notion of compensatory legitimation. I'm not sure how well, and it looks like it translated perfectly. Thank you. And this is the idea that the purpose of education is to compensate the working class or to compensate the middle class. And when we see strikes or we see riots, the idea is that, oh, we'll give you money so you can go to school, and so you're not protesting on the streets. Well, not quite that simple, of course, but the idea is that one of the reasons that the state can use higher education is to compensate people for their position as being working class or their position of being unemployed. And we're seeing some of this, of course, right now, if you've been watching the news with the riots in London, in the UK, is that we have a lot of out-of-work and undereducated and perhaps even some overeducated individuals who need some compensation and they're very angry that they're not getting jobs, that they're not getting into school, they're not getting the things that they want. And so we see sometimes the use by the state of higher education to compensate and make things legitimate for individuals. So this relates to the national project of education, is that we think about, so what's the purpose of specifically higher education, because that's what we're talking about today, and how does our education at the local level, the state level, or even the national level, how does that relate to global issues? And so part of my thesis is that we're a little out of joint in the United States by focusing too much on globalization and not enough on the national project of education. And as I talk about this more, I'll talk about Mexico, more about Brazil that I know more about, is that the problem has been the emphasis on looking globally rather than looking nationally, is that we are often in public universities, we are the public university of the country or the state, but we're focused too much on how's our ratings look on the international level, which I think is causing problems, especially in the United States for us. Well, let me talk just a little bit about the establishment of higher education in the United States as a way of sort of understanding the background again. And this was interesting for me when I was preparing for the lecture, because I hadn't studied too much, and looking at the origins of Harvard and Yale. So Harvard was founded in the United States in 1640, as we show on the slide here, and it was founded by the Puritans, which were a religious branch. And so they were, again, escaping what they saw as repression in England and then came to the United States. And so Harvard was started by Puritans, and Yale came along in 1701, and it was started by Congregationalists. Now, these are Protestant groups. I don't know a whole lot about either, of course, but if I had to distinguish between Puritans and Congregationalists, I probably couldn't do that for you. But the main idea is that these are slightly different Christian sects that were escaping from the Catholic Church and from the repression they felt in England. And what they were very interested in doing, in addition to having religious tolerance, is that they were interested in taking care of the youth, of their children, essentially, by sending them to universities. And so this is the concept of in loco parentis, that is, in place of the parent. And so even in the 1640s and the 1700s, much of the role of the university was to take the place of the parent and to provide that. And so they provided supervision and dormitories for the parents that we still, of course, do today, at least in the U.S. universities. So the U.S., because of how it was formed, is very much the melting pot and bringing together people from different races and different religions. Not so much race at the beginning, but at least by religions. And part of the growth of the nation of the U.S. was very much based on the notion of post-colonial colleges, the idea that after we became independent, that we created these different colleges. And even then, we already had the notions of the blue states and the red states, although we just didn't call it that. And again, this was the idea of the cosmopolitan areas like New York and Boston. But then as we advanced and opened up the frontier of the United States, in the middle states, they became more conservative than the states on the coast. So let me give you an example, though, of the contested notions of higher education. And this was something that I found that was interesting to me. My family background is I'm a Spanish Jew, Sephardic. And so it was very interesting for me. My parents were born in New York City, and both went to school in at New York University, which was, the time they went to school was very much a Jewish university, because Harvard had what was called the Jewish problem in 1921. And the reason I give this to you is not so much just to focus on Judaism, but the idea of the contested nature of higher education in the United States. And it's not been smooth sailing the whole way. And so the Jewish problem was based on the thought that I was looking at the translation, the cult of scholarship. And this is the idea that Jews, because we were primarily urban people, we didn't have land, we weren't farmers, and because of our religion, that is, it's okay to argue with the rabbi. In fact, you're supposed to argue. You're all being way too quiet, but I understand why, that we get through this. But part of it is to argue with each other constantly, and through that we learn. And we push each other to greater intellectual traditions. So there was a cult of scholarship among Jews. And so the Jews were doing too well at Harvard. They were doing much better than the white students and the upper class students. And so in 1921, Harvard said, well, we have this Jewish problem because they're urban dwellers, they have a background of white collar, and they're highly educated. And so we were beginning to see, even in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the conflict and the cultural clash in the United States over the Jews. So I found this song for you. I can't sing, so I won't try and sing it to you, but I will read it in English for you. And it says, it's a 1910 college song that college students used to sing, and it said, "Oh, Harvard is run by millionaires, Yale is run by booze, alcohol, and Cornell is run by farmers' sons, but Columbia is run by Jews." And so this is an amazing song when you think about it, for people to be singing, and how racist it was in 1910 to have this as a song that college students were singing. So we have a long history of discrimination and unfairness in the United States, and so we're forever trying to come back from that. And this is 100 years ago. So it's really somewhat recent. And in fact, my parents went to New York University, and they went to school in the 1940s because that was the Jewish Harvard. Because Harvard had quotas, they would limit the number of Jews who could come to Harvard. Yale had the same thing. Actually, Columbia did too about that time. So my parents went to New York University because it was the Jewish university essentially, and it was where the intellectual Jews went for many years. So let me give you just quickly, since I'm not a historian, I'll go through fairly quickly the significant events in U.S. higher education. And some of these have been significant events for Mexico as well, because I always hear the joke that when the U.S. sneezes, Mexico catches a cold, and so and it's not fair, but it's the idea that we have such a large economy that it affects everybody, as we're seeing now with our mistreatment of the housing crisis and Wall Street problems. So significant events, to give you real quickly, is there's the post-colonial transformation period, and this was roughly 1870 to 1944. And basically this is where the upper classes and upper middle class were the only ones who went to higher education. That higher education was not readily available throughout the United States to the working class or even much of the middle class. But this changed after World War II and the GI Bill. And I'm not sure if you are familiar with the GI Bill, but these are when the soldiers came back from the Second World War, they were given money to go to school because the U.S. government realized they were going to have this huge workforce that was not very well educated and needed to find a job. Well, there weren't jobs available, so a good place to put them was in universities. And so the motives were not necessarily to improve education as the motives were to keep people busy. And so primarily men went back to school after they got out of the Second World War. And so this was a huge increase in universities in the United States. Community colleges came along at the same time, and so there was a massive influx of the middle class and even the working class to higher education. So this was probably one of the most significant events in higher education in the United States, this huge increase in the number of students who attended school after the Second World War. And my father was one of those. He was a commander in the Navy, and he came back and got his graduate education. He already had his undergraduate degree, but he came back and got his master's and doctorate on the GI Bill, like a lot of people. Well, and then the most significant event in my lifetime was Sputnik. And this was Sputnik, I think we were arguing the other day whether it was 1951 or 52 that Sputnik was shot up, but hopefully all of you know about Sputnik. This is when the Russians put the first satellite into orbit. So in 1951, the Russians shot up a small satellite that roughly looks like the picture. And this was an extraordinary event. In fact, I remember as I was in grade school in 51 and 52, and we watched it on television. They made all of us sit down and we watched it on, not that we could see very much because they weren't taking pictures of Sputnik, but this was an extraordinary event, and the response in the United States was interesting. The U.S. government created the National Defense Act because the concern was, remember this is just after the Second World War, that Russia was getting ahead of the United States in science and technology, and we better catch up. And so the way we could catch up was to put a huge amount of money into science and technology in the schools in the United States and develop NASA and develop the National Institutes of Science and put a huge amount of money so we could compete with the Russians. Well, these weren't the best motives in the world, of course, to improve education. But the good part about this was that it increased money into schools and to higher education. The bad part, it was the beginning of the military-industrial complex. And so we see a huge emphasis on military issues and not much interest in the arts or the social sciences. The big push was to catch up with Russia because they were ahead of us. Then something more contemporary that you probably understand, and my esteemed colleague on the left had a little part in this later on, was the civil rights in the Vietnam War and the protests that occurred in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s and demanding equal rights. And the beginning of it was after the Vietnam War, people demanding access to community colleges, the issues of civil rights, respect for students, and the huge student movements that were created in the 60s and 70s and 80s came out of that very much from the returning of veterans from Vietnam, the demonstration for civil rights. And these were also huge impacts on the effects of higher education in the United States. The unfortunate thing was it didn't add any money. It detracted money because we still have legislators throughout the United States who are still mad about the 60s and still mad at the universities for causing all these problems. And so again, we have the red states and the blue states and these culture wars where there's still a lot of anger over student movements and the protests. And this relates to what has often been called the crisis of white mediocrity, which I think is a great way to put it. And this was in the 1980s, and then there was a big report in the United States called The Nation at Risk. And this was the idea that our education system is failing. And really, it wasn't so much the education system was failing, is that now the whites had to share the educational system with the blacks and the browns and the Jews and other cultural groups. And so it was more a crisis of white mediocrity, meaning the whites were concerned that everybody else was catching up with them. And so they didn't want to share. And so this led to some great concerns and lots of different reports and a lot of hand-wringing on the parts of legislators in the United States. So this has led to pretty much what we have now, which we can call the corporate university. Has Simon been here? Did Simon talk? Yeah. I don't know if Simon Marginson has done a lot of good work on looking at the corporate university or the entrepreneurial university, as has Sheila Slaughter. And we've all been involved with it somewhat. But a different perspective I want to bring for you is the culture of professionalism. And this is Bledstein's work, who's Jewish, of course, so that you're supposed to laugh. That's to see if you're awake. The culture of professionalism. This is the idea that the reason for schooling and the reason for higher education was essentially to start certifying professionals so people could create jobs for themselves, could create professions for themselves. And this is the legitimation of authority. And a good example of this is psychologists. Not that I have anything against psychologists. In fact, my doctorate is in social psychology. But psychologists are the best example of creating a field that maybe we don't necessarily need. And the idea of people having to go to psychologists or psychiatrists to have their heads fixed, essentially. And so whereas this had been done often before in the families, and this had often been done as part of society, now it's become professionalized by psychologists and psychiatrists. And so, not that I don't think that some of them do a very, very good job, and it's a very comforting thing to be able to call on these people and have support. But you can see that it's created a profession. And you can think of all sorts of other professions that have been created to legitimize authority. And universities have been part of this because we benefit by licensing people and giving people licenses. And so the argument that Bledstein makes is that we've gone too far. that we've substituted objective principles for patriarchy, and this notion of the idea that you can't be fixed or you can't be healthy unless you go to a professional, and that professional gets certified in the university. So on one hand, it's been good for the universities that we've created this professional demand, but the biggest problem has been it's led to hyper-specialization. And this is the idea that we all become narrower and narrower and narrower. And so you have to go to one person for one specific thing. And partly life has become much more complicated, of course. But the problem is that everyone has become so specialized we can't even talk to each other. And that's led to a problem in higher education, certainly, is we have trouble talking across fields. The sociologists can't talk to the psychologists anymore, who can't talk to the historians, and nobody can talk to the philosophers. And so that, and you can't be certified. If you're not an economist, you can't talk about economic issues. And so, which is silly. Just a quick note about academic capitalism. This is Sheila Slaughter's work and Larry Leslie. And Sheila is a very good friend of ours. And I like her work very much. And I think this whole notion of academic capitalism is a very good way to explain what's going on in higher education today. And so she draws much of her work on resource dependency theory, which just simply is if you need more resources, you go get them. And so you are dependent upon resources. And so in higher education, it's forced us to engage in practices that probably aren't the best for intellectual growth, but it's a good way to get money to support our research endeavors. And we all play the game for better or for worse. But it's led to a very entrepreneurial aspect. And the problem has been the fields that are closest to the market are the ones that do the best. So fields like business do very well in higher education because they're close to the market. They can sell their products. Sciences, depending on the science, does very well. We don't do as well in education because we're not as close to the market. Even physics, which is interesting, that used to be one of the premier fields in the United States, has fallen now because we're not supporting the space race as much anymore. And so they're disinvesting in physics, which is, again, some of my concern that we're eating our seed corn. We've swung back the other way. So one of the problems with academic capitalism is that it leads to market failures. The idea of that, okay, if you can't make any money by being a philosopher, then who's going to go be a philosopher? And if you can't make any money by being an artist, then who's going to become an artist? And that's the problem that we're seeing, is that those fields aren't supported because they're not close to the market. And we're having universities that really aren't looking as much like universities anymore. They're looking more like business schools, or they're looking more like entrepreneurial universities in the market. So again, this is my concern, that we're disinvesting in higher education and we're not supporting the entire concept of the university. And this is where we see higher education really as a commodity, and that it's something to be sold and bought. And so we have financial aid for students that in the U.S. is a mixed blessing. It's a good idea to provide support for students, but students have huge debt when they get out of school. And students take their money and spend it sometimes unwisely on private entrepreneurial universities that promise them jobs that they don't get. And so we're seeing this crisis in the United States over financial aid. And so it's not always so good to have market choice. And if we're supposed to be in loco parentis, we should have some right about how we help students move forward. And there's that balance between being too prescriptive for students but not being prescriptive enough. Now comes my favorite slide. You might recognize this individual standing in front of one of the entrepreneurial universities. This is at University of Virginia. Well, I want to shift my talk a little bit. I want to shift a little bit now to talk about sort of the place that higher education plays in the world as a way of talking about some of my concerns. So in the United States right now, this is the GDP contributions to higher education. And let me say that it was an interesting survey as I looked on the internet, looked in books, looked in resources. Everything I looked at was different. I couldn't find two of the same GDP contributions across the World Bank, across the IMF, across my colleagues' work. So my suggestion for you is find one source that you believe in, or one source that you can trust, and just stick with that source, because at least the explanations will be the same and it'll be comparable. So just essentially, you can see the United States is 2.9%, and so it's the highest. Korea, to its great strength, is also doing very well. And we in the United States have a lot to learn from Korea, because Korea is a country with very few natural resources. And so they're putting their money into education, as Japan has done. And so it's also interesting here that, as you see the number 3rd rank, this is California. You may know that country that's on the West Coast, that has the 2nd biggest city in Mexico, Los Angeles. I've heard that. California, even though California is in great trouble financially, they're still contributing a huge percentage of their GDP to higher education. Of course, they're cutting that, though, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. You should be proud of Mexico. You're right there at the top as number 5th, and you see the list goes down.
It only shows that you cannot trust that source. No se puede confiar en esa fuente que has utilizado.
Yeah, so be careful of your sources. This is for comparative purposes only. That was a good way to show a nice picture of Imanol. One of the issues here in looking at that list of GDP is that list, although it wasn't exactly by the gross national product of the countries, but it did show the countries that are the top country, some of the top countries in the world, including California, which I think has the 11th largest economy in the world. So what I wanted to look at in this next slide is to show how the aspect of money, economics equals academic dominance. And this isn't necessarily fair, but this is a way for us to help understand what's going on, at least within the United States and larger issues. So this was an interesting amount of information for me that I hadn't seen. And again, I looked at different sources, and they all had different amounts of money, so I just stuck with one source. But what's most interesting on this information is that Harvard has $36.5 billion, and Yale almost has half. So it shows how huge Harvard is and how far ahead Harvard is of anybody else. And in fact, I read some other statements that Harvard does not have to charge tuition. It could pay for all of its students for the next hundreds of years based on its endowment. Well, why does it charge tuition? Well, because it can, but also because about half the students at Harvard go to Harvard because their families can afford it. And they are the establishment of the East Coast. And so those are the individuals that pay full tuition. And then the other half goes to scholarships and a percentage of students who they bring from around the United States. But you see the list of Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton. These would be typical guesses. Texas is a public university, the University of Texas in Austin, that you're probably familiar with. And it's has the largest endowment of public universities. And then as you see the list goes on with a mixture of public and private universities. Well, the issue of endowment, I'm not sure if it makes as much sense to you, but all the universities in the United States do fundraising every year to raise money to get contributions from alumni. And so this is what helps build the endowment. And of course, where they get the real big money is when somebody dies, they donate part of their fortune to their favorite school. And so this is how Harvard has gotten so rich, because it's had a long time for people to die and donate money to the institution. But this also shows, as we'll see in the global rankings, that remember who has the most money, and we'll see what is your guess on the global rankings. No surprise, Harvard is number 1. I'm not sure what happened to Yale, but they're only number 11th. This is the Shanghai ratings that I think you're probably familiar with. And I want to talk a little bit more about the ratings, because I'm not I'm not a big fan of the ratings. I think they have some real problems that I'll talk about in just a minute. But this is the global ranking that lists primarily the U.S. universities that do very well. Oxford is number 10, so we have a few outsiders. And University of Tokyo is number 20. And it's interesting, if you're not familiar with the Japanese system, the University of Tokyo is the very, very top of the pyramid, and it's a combination of Princeton, Yale, and Harvard all in one, and very, very exclusive. So it's the primary university that all the prime ministers go to, and it has a huge impact in Japan. But it's still only ranked number 20 on the national scale. But and again, as you see different ratings, of course, there'll be some movement. A few universities will be in different places, but in general, it's the Harvards and the Stanfords and the Yales and the Princetons at the top, and public universities, Berkeley in California, UCLA, UC San Diego. And I think you'll see, based on what we saw on the earlier slide, California has in the past made a huge contribution towards higher education from its GDP, and it shows in the universities. Berkeley is certainly always considered one of the best of the public universities, as is UCLA, and University of California at San Diego, which you may not know as well, is also considered one of the best of the universities. So now I want to talk a little bit about the ratings, which I don't particularly like. And I think the thing that's most interesting about the ratings is, while there have been ratings around for a long time, the current hysteria over ratings has been caused by China. Because in about 2000, China had a lot of money to spend on sending students to different universities. And so they needed to know where they should send their students because they didn't know very much about universities. So they created the Shanghai rating system. So the problem with this is China's perspective of what are the top universities. And this is their perspective based on science and technology. They are interested most in sending their students to universities that are closest to the market. They want their students to study fields that they'll bring back with science and technology. So the performance ratings are not based on what we might think in North and South America and Central America as the most important factors of universities. It's what China thinks. And so much of the concerns that everybody has about, where's my ranking? Why are we ranked lower? Why are we ranked higher? Why is one university ranked higher than another? Is based on the Chinese rankings. So I find some real problems with that. And so on my lecture to have everybody understand that this is China's perspective. And it's something that should be questioned. So we have these responses now to these rating systems. And so the UK response has been to create the Higher Education Funding Council of England. And it's created an extremely cumbersome audit procedure where every university has to account for their expenses and how much the university professors are teaching and what kind of money they're bringing in and what's the market value of the instructor and what's the market value of the university. And so it's created this huge bureaucracy that is really not helping anything but increasing the attentiveness to the ratings, which again, as I said, they're China's ratings. Now, there are other rating systems, of course, but much of the push was created by China's interest. Now, I don't know UNAM very well, but I know you do have the SNE, which I think has its benefits and disadvantages. And so really I just pose the question to you, is SNE a good idea? And so my perspective from the outside is it's highly technical. It rewards only certain kinds of intellect. It rewards only certain kinds of procedures, and it's forcing people to do publications and presentations along certain lines that, again, are focused more towards the market, as opposed to what the social sciences provides, what the arts provides, what the theater provides, what music provides. And so my understanding of SNE is it's very bureaucratic, and it's nice if you're a member of SNE, but I'm not sure this is the best way to respond to quality assurance in higher education. And my favorite one in the U.S. is Texas A&M University, in Texas, of course, has a profit and loss procedure that you have to do as a professor. So that is, you have to show what your salary is as a professor, how many students you're teaching, how much money you're bringing in as a professor, and then you're ranked based on your profitability as a professor. Well, the philosophers don't do very well, and the business people do very well. So who gets supported in the university? So it plays into science and technology and business. They're the ones who do very, very well. And the outside fields, who are on the periphery from the market, do very poorly. In education and economics, we tend to do okay. We're sort of in the middle because we can see the market from where we are, and we study the market. And so we're not at the bottom, but we're certainly not at the top. So we're sort of in the middle. Well, the thing I want to talk about with the ratings, or my concern about the ratings, is they're not culturally appropriate. Remember, this is China's perspective. And so one of the issues is not understanding the differences cross-culturally that this rating system does not understand. And most rating systems don't. So I want to share with you a little work by Trompenaers, who's a Belgian, and has done some really interesting work on cross-cultural issues. And again, some of his work is rather dated, and so we're not taking it as the absolute truth, but it raises questions for us. And so one of the first things he asks people, looking at cross-cultural issues, is country by country, do we believe that an individual is responsible for their decisions? What is your belief in individual decision-making? That is, how much independence and freedom do you have? And so as we see on the scale, the Russians believe they have the most independence, and the Spanish believe they have the least on this scale. Now again, this isn't perfect, of course, and one could argue that, well, maybe Japan should be below Spain and vice versa. And is that the proper place for Mexico and the proper place for Brazil? But by presenting this, I want you to just think about in terms of how do you see your own culture? And how do you see the Mexican culture compared to the Spanish culture? But we all know that we're also not one culture, that Mexico is just not one culture. The United States is not one culture. We have our blue states and red states, and you have your political parties. And so there are different cultural groups. But it is an interesting way to think in terms of individual decision-making, and how is this reflected in our support of higher education, and in our rating systems, and how we look at the market. Let me give you another example. And to me, this is always interesting, having lived in Brazil for a bit and studied a number of different countries, is that how much does respect depend on the family background? So the way the question was worded, it's kind of confusing. Respect does not depend on family background. So in the U.S., we say, no, respect is not, it doesn't matter what family you're from. You have an equal chance at respect, which I don't quite agree with, because I think we're very much more involved and based on what our families are in the U.S. And I wouldn't necessarily agree that Brazil is at the other end. But it's an interesting question to ask, and an interesting scale, is that what's your family background? How important is that in how you make decisions, the job that you choose, where you are in the economic structure? And so these are really good cultural questions to consider. Again, nothing that's considered in the ratings. Nothing that's considered in how we assess higher education. Because what I'm getting to is, what's the purpose of higher education in all of these countries? What's our expectations? Why are we expecting our students to come into higher education? And so how is this reflected in our cultural values that are different? And as Trompenaers does a pretty good job of explaining. One more for him, and this is personal responsibility for actions, is that, are we responsible for our own actions? And in the U.S., we would say, yes, we're responsible. And then at the other end, the Chinese say, no, we're not responsible. And so it's, I don't know if it's karma or family background or the larger cultural issues. And unfortunately, he didn't survey Mexico on this one. I'm not sure why. But you could sort of guess maybe where you might be. Maybe between Argentina and Spain. because of your cultural backgrounds. But, but again, the interesting aspect in this is looking that we have differences across cultures. And by trying to understand the purpose of higher education and our contributions, the rating systems don't understand at all or even attempt to understand that what you're doing in Mexico at UNAM might be very different than what a university in China is doing. And that's okay, because again, that's back to that national project versus the globalization project, is that you are the autonomous University of Mexico. We are, in my university, we are the University of Southern Oregon. And so we have a specific function that we have to play, and we don't necessarily have to be compared with everybody else in the world because we have a different purpose, we have a different culture, we have some different cultural values. And again, back to my thesis, I'm saying in the United States at least, we're not living up to those cultural values. We're disinvesting in higher education because we're in danger of eating our seed corn. We're not producing the full range of people that we need. We're focusing too much on science and technology. Where do the artists come from? Where do the politicians come from? Well, I probably don't want to know where the politicians come from, but at least in the United States. One more thing on Trump and Harris's work. This is sort of interesting. The idea here is that how are organizations distributed in our different countries? And this is the idea that in Turkey, they have a very hierarchical system. There is a very strong top and a very small bottom. And then as he studied this, he goes through in Mexico, Brazil, and Spain, he would say that you have a little wider bottom, but also a strong top. And in the United States, we have a very, very flat system where everybody can participate to a large extent. Of course, again, it depends on the organization, it depends on the institution. But just in general, this is sort of an interesting way to look at how organizations are distributed, which is why perhaps there might be so many protests in Mexico, because you have a base that isn't being recognized perhaps as much as it should. And so it's important for the base to be protesting and arguing to the very peak to say that, okay, we need to be heard. We would like a flatter bottom and a greater participation, perhaps like the United States. Of course, we're not perfect either, but we tend to have a flatter base and a greater level of participation. You should recognize the library. It was actually one of the prettiest pictures I found when I was looking at things to put on the PowerPoint. I want to just talk just briefly about some cross-cultural cases, and then come back in my concluding thoughts to where we are with higher education. Japan focuses very much its universities on salarymen and bureaucrats. That's the purpose of its universities, is to create salarymen. And they are very unconcerned about arts and social sciences, and the Japanese professors I've interviewed were very concerned about the future. Well, where are the social scientists coming from? Where are the artists coming from? All we're doing is creating salarymen and bureaucrats. And salarymen, of course, are the businessmen, and bureaucrats are the ones who go into government. So there's great concerns about what's happening in Japan and their universities. And so, again, should they be following the rankings, the international rankings? University of Southern California is a private university that's fairly wealthy. I think it was on that list when we looked at the numbers of things. They have a program, to give you an example of what they're doing to improve their university, of $1 million for the stars. So what they're doing is they're stealing professors from other universities and paying them $1 million. And it's actually working pretty well. I'm not sure if I'd live in Los Angeles for $1 million, but I'd think about it. And so so this is a way to recruit and to build up the establishment of the university. And they're raising money from their endowment and paying big-time professors. Now, of course, they're not going to pay an education professor $1 million or an economist $1 million, but they are going after scientists and chemists and physics and business professors to pay them that larger amount of money. I want to talk just a minute about Southern Oregon University, where I am. I used to be at the University of Oregon, as Imanol explained, which is the major research university in my state of Oregon. And Southern Oregon University is sort of a branch regional university that's in the the skiing is much better, and it's an artistic community. And it was rated in a statewide rating system in Outdoor Magazine as the 20th best university for outdoor recreation. So that didn't make the international ratings because that's not on the list. But for what we do at my university, that's really important because we live in the mountains. And I live a half hour from the ski hill. And so recreation is very, very important. So we attract students who are interested in the environment, who are in programs in environmental sciences, who are in programs that do outdoor recreation and outdoor education and hospitality programs. So this is really important for our university. That is, we're not upset that we're not on the international rankings, because for the purpose of our university, it's better to be rated on something that we're focusing on and something that we're good at, because we live in this wonderful natural environment. And the New York Times called us one of the hidden gems of the United States. I'm not sure what that means, but no, the idea was that we're one of these, a very small, very nice university that's a great place to go to school because it's safe. The town is 20,000. The mountains are all around. We have snow up in the mountains most of the year. And so it's a very, very comfortable place to live. So in terms of what's important for us at our institution and our purpose, this is a much better way to evaluate us. But also we need to go to our legislature and say, okay, look, we're doing a good job, that you need to fund us at a level that's appropriate because we're meeting our goals, we're meeting our mission. So which made me question and think about UNAM is that in one rating system I saw that you were ranked first in Central and South America, but yet you're only rated 221st in the world. Well, that doesn't make any sense. You know, how can you be number one in one of the largest areas of the world, but only ranked 225 or 21? So I think there's something wrong with the rating. Is that you're doing a very good job in your region, in your continent, and being very competitive, but the international rankings is not recognizing that. And so again, the international ranking is recognizing what's important for China, not perhaps what's important for UNAM. And as by way of comparison, Harvard spends $2.6 billion a year for 20,000 students. And UNAM, obviously this is old information, spends $1.5 billion for 260,000 students. So I understand over 300,000 now. So it'd be interesting to see but the comparison is the idea that look how much more money Harvard has to spend. But you're doing a very good job because you're not trying to be exclusive and excluding other individuals like Harvard does. You're an open university that's trying to serve the needs of the population. And so you're serving a different function. So to be compared to Harvard really doesn't make any sense. So it got me thinking about the structure of institutions. Is that UNAM is so huge, of course, and you're broken up into schools and colleges. But I looked at Cambridge and Oxford, and they have very, very distinct colleges that are almost autonomous from the large university. And so there would be interesting ways that you could boost the ratings if you wanted to by spinning off different colleges and being different parts of the institution. But yet that's not what UNAM is. So you could play the ratings game, but you would lose your culture. And so I think it's important to understand that how much are you accomplishing the things that you want to accomplish. Claremont University in California is an interesting example. They have 5 different schools, different names. Harvey Mudd, I'll forget the names of them, but the Claremont Graduate University. And so they have all sorts of different universities that are combined together in the Claremont colleges. So there are different formats, but yet the ratings are looking at everything as the same. And again, we don't have the same cultures. We're not the same organizations or same schools. So this leads me to my conclusions. And this is from H.G. Wells. I'll give you a second to read it. Human history becomes more and more race between education and catastrophe. And I've always liked this, even as uncomfortable as it is. I mean, I think the reason that I got into education was because I wanted to make a difference. And I still see education as the best way to improve society, is to have an educated electorate. And even if it's not shared by others, I still think this is the best way to do. And to have strong educational systems from the top to the bottom. And of course, we focus on higher education, so we want higher education to be much better than it is because of this impending catastrophe if we don't do a better job of educating people. So let me conclude now that Jacoby has an interesting book on the last intellectuals, and he says that social conflict is not an engineering problem, meaning that all we have to do is hire a consultant or hire a professional, as I was talking about before, and they'll fix it for us, is that it's much more complicated than that. And so, unfortunately, when we do rating scales and systems, we see it as an engineering problem. And then to look at failed states, why do states fail? I just, as Imanol told you, I just finished a study on Angola. And it was really interesting and sad to study Africa because of all the failed states. And Angola, for example, has been at civil war for 30 years and has just a very few universities because they can't support it because they've been busy fighting each other. And so there is a complete lack of intellectual background in the country. And so it's on the list as one of the failed states. So again, where's the source for intellectuals? In Japan and in Angola, and those sorts of issues. The rankings, as of course you've understood, I don't like them. I think it pits egalitarianism against global elitism. Is if you want to be an egalitarian institution, you won't score well on the international rankings because you have to be globally elite. And this seems to fit UNAM's problems. You're trying to be an egalitarian institution, but the international rankings are based on who's close to the market because prestige flows to the market. And although it's meant as humorous, is that there aren't any football rankings in the international ranking scales. Shouldn't there be rankings by how good our football teams are? And so, which is somewhat humorous, but it's the idea that we're more than just a ranking system. We're a university that provides all sorts of aspects and support for students, from sciences to the arts to sports. And so that's what a university is to us. But that doesn't seem to be what the university is to China. China isn't sending students to play football. They're sending students to come back and bring science and technology to China. That's the rating system. So again, to conclude, we have this class war where we're having the middle-class families have to pay an unfair burden of share. We have a declining gross national product contribution. And so we're looking for expedient solutions for the upper class. It's okay to cut universities because the upper class can still go. And so this is really convenient, but is it really a moral way to look at a democracy? So my final slide is solutions. And so my solution is to go snowboarding because I only live 25 minutes away from the ski area and I'm on the ski patrol. But that's been my selection in life, the way to deal with it. So you have other choices to make, as do universities. But I think to me the solutions is that universities need to be more autonomous. I mean, you even have autonomous in your name. In the U.S., we don't really even understand that. We need to be much more autonomous to be able to act as individual institutions. We need to be more democratic than we are as institutions. Again, that structure of to flatten the bottom so we can be much more democratic as an organization with the students and the faculty having a much greater role. We need to have more culturally appropriate higher education. Again, as I was showing you on those tables, we need to have education that fits our culture, not that fits what China wants. And so we have to have it be more appropriate to our individual culture. We have to have more higher education for the working classes. I think we have to expand. As Imanol told you, I studied community colleges. I'm very interested in where the working class and middle class can go to school. And are we doing a very good job of giving them access? And I don't think we are. An important one for me, I'm a former dean,
is to deprofessionalize administrators. I don't think administrators at universities should be professional administrators. I think the positions of rector and deans should rotate every 3 to 5 years because we become too professionals as administrators. The only position I think that should be a professional one is the vice rector or vice president for finances. That person, it's okay to have them be a professional. But the other positions are academic positions, and I think they should rotate, because at least in the United States, we end up with these lifelong deans and lifelong rectors who become tyrants and control the institution. And I don't think it's healthy for anybody. I think we need to do a better job of promoting disinterested research, that is, fund basic research. Doesn't have to be research that takes us to the market. It can be research on a whole variety of social sciences and arts and things that aren't necessarily to make money, essentially. And we have to escape from the market mentality we have of the entrepreneurial university. We have to get back to the notions of the purpose of a university and how it promotes our culture and the purpose that we have a university within our states and within our countries. So I'll stop there. I guess we'll take a break for a little bit and come back for questions.
Yes.
Okay,
Sí.
good.
Vamos entonces, después de la presentación, a hacer la pausa tradicional en cada una de nuestras sesiones. Vayan pensando sus preguntas y sus comentarios para la segunda parte de esta sesión. Entonces nos vemos en 15 minutos.
Thank you. That's hard for people late in the afternoon.
Let's go have some coffee or something outside.
Only one thing.
I didn't like your conference.
Didn't
Only
like
one
what?
thing you didn't like.